said, like, look, the first thing is that Rava explained Rav Yossi Bar Chanina, and he turned around and he said, look, Rav Yossi Bar Chanina doesn't explain it the way the Gemara thinks his explanation is. What Rav Yossi Bar Chanina is actually saying is that exile is insufficient for him because his guilt is too great, that exile should atone for it. And he's not exiled at all. That's number one. So spiritually, he doesn't get the opportunity. And number two, he doesn't get the opportunity to get protected if the family come after him. That I read straight out. Okay, why? Because the carpenter, after giving permission and still carrying on with lethal equipment, is an unintentional murderer bordering on intentional. Fine. But then Rava doesn't agree that he shouldn't get exile. He was just saying that's Rav Yosef Achanina's explanation, that he understood it. The Gemara's explanation of Rav Yossi Bar Chanina is that the reason why he doesn't get exile is that it's talking about domains here. And it's saying that even though he gave him permission, you're still dealing with a private domain compared to a public domain where both of them were allowed to enter. So they're saying that the case doesn't fit the prototype. And he doesn't agree with this at all. And the reason he doesn't agree is he said, look, if we're saying that in a forest where both of them have permission to be, that they should be aware of each other. How do you know that they should be aware of each other? Well, if a person isn't barred from being there, then obviously there's a chance that a person could be there. And therefore, before you deal with lethal equipment, you need to check that there's nobody around. And that on that basis, because you didn't check, and that's gross negligence, if you committed an unintentional murder, you got to exile. Here the guy gave permission. Here he definitely knows, the carpenter, that a customer has entered his shop. And since a customer has entered his shop, in this particular case, he's definitely aware somebody is there. So there's no excuse that he doesn't get exiled because it doesn't fit the prototype. The only explanation he gives is maybe he doesn't get exiled because what he's done here is far worse. In the forest case, there could be somebody there. In this case where he gave permission, he definitely has somebody there. So he's saying it's not because it doesn't fit the prototype. So now Kevin answered a good question 2 days ago. What was the question? Is that Rava has an explanation and said, look, there's a case where there's a court-appointed lash giver. And what happens is that he gives lashes based on what the physicians determine is allowable based on that person's health condition. How do we know this? Because if I share the screen on Makot 22b, what does it say? It turns around and it says, if the one being flogged dies at the hand of the attendant, the latter is exempt because he acted at the derivative of the court. But if the attendant added for him an additional lash with the strap and he died, the attendant is exiled to a city of refuge on his account as an unwitting murderer. So what he's saying here is Rava is saying this is his proof from Makot 22 that, in fact, for an unintentional murderer bordering on intentional, we give him exile. So he doesn't agree with Rav Yossi Bar Chanina's opinion. Now the Gemara's got a question, the same question that Kevin asked on Rava. That's why I knew Kevin was as sharp as a razor. Is that he said, well, listen, how do we know it's intentional? Maybe the guy just can't count very well. He's picked an interesting way to earn a living, though. He can't count so well, but that's just my thought on the matter. But be that as it may, Kevin, I thought the question was good that you asked. It was dead on the mark. Who's to say it was intentional? Maybe he just got mixed up with the count. Does that make sense, guys? So that doesn't mean it was intentional. It's not like you're giving permission to come down in your shop and you're busy with the angle grinder. Very different case. So what's the Gemara's explanation to that? It says here as follows. And I'm just going to read it outright. Rava challenged this ruling from the following Mishnah. And if the agent of the court who is administering the lashes added one extra lash to the son and he died as a result of that extra lash, the agent is exiled because of him. Now here in the Mishnah, we are dealing with a case where the agent of the court was an unintentional murderer bordering on intentional. For he should have been mindful that people can die through that one extra lash. Yet the Mishnah state that he's exiled. So we can see that an unintentional murderer whose gross negligence borders on the intentional is subject to exile. And the Gemara answers, Rav Shimei of Nahadia said that the Mishnah refers to where the agent made a mistake in the count. So what does this mean? Exactly as Kevin said, that the agent's mistake doesn't border on the intentional, and that's exactly why he's subject to exile. He miscounted, okay? So then the Gemara responds as follows. Rava tapped Rav Shimei on his shoe. So what does this mean? It doesn't mean that Rava, literally tapped him on the shoe, because they could have been born in two separate places or two separate eras a little bit. It's saying when you tap someone in the shoe, what do you think that means? If I nudge you on the shoe at a table, it means, listen, maybe there's something I want to tell you that you should know. So what's Rava's response? He said, Rava tapped Rav Shimei on his shoe and said to him, is it the agent who counts out the number of lashes? Why, it's been taught in a brisa which describes the procedure of administering lashes. Okay? The most prominent of the judges reads the scriptural selections. Okay, so that's the first step. The second judge counts out each lash before it's administered, and the third judge says to the agent, strike him. So it's the judge rather than the agent who keeps track of the count. How can you say that the Mishnah refers to where the agent made a mistake in the count? Okay, so firstly, I've got a slight question on this. If that's Rava's response to Rav Shimei of Nahadia, then how could he say that it's the lash's fault in any event? Because again, Rav Shimei of Nahadia is turning around and saying, listen, the person giving the lashes had a mix-up with the count. And then Rav is responding to him and he said he can't have a mix-up with the count because he's not the one doing the counting. You've got three judges in the case. The first judge, he has to read the scriptural verses. What are the scriptural verses? If you have a look, it's in Deuteronomy chapter 28:58. That's written. If you do not observe to do, that's the first admonishment. And Hashem will make wondrous your blows and the blows of, it's talking about lashes. Then it goes on to verse 59, and you shall observe the words of this covenant. And then it goes on to chapter 29, verse 8. But he, the merciful one, is forgiving of iniquity, and it goes through Psalms, etc. So before you get lashed, it's giving, the first judge tells you where it's written that you get a lash for such an offense. And then the second judge says what, Gav? What does he say?
He gives the actual count.
Excellent. He gives the actual count. Kevin, what does the third judge do?
Administers?
No, he says strike him. He gives the
order. He orders.
Right.
Okay. The court official does administers the lashes.
Correct. So this is my problem. How can Rava then turn around to Rav Shimei and said, listen, it's not that the lasher is mistaking the count, because he's not the one that does the counting. So then why would Rava, just on a side note, held him accountable for giving an extra lash if he's not the one doing the counting? Good question, right?
Why should he only be responsible?
Firstly, exactly that. Why is the judge not responsible? That's the one question. The other question is, well, why is the lasher responsible? Because the third judge said to the lasher, strike him. He gave an order. The second judge turned around and is giving the count. So how's it the lasher's responsible? And if the judge mixes up the count, why would the lasher be responsible? Because he's following the orders. So then how can Rava say that in that case the lasher is responsible, bordering on what do you call it, on the intentional? Why? Because he doesn't strike on his own. The third judge has to say strike him before the striker judge lashes. So either the third judge said strike him and he's responsible, or the judge miscounting is responsible. Arthur, where are you? Okay, Arthur's gone AWOL. So, all right. So, guys, do you have any proposals before I give an answer? I want you to think. Kevin so impressed me last time. I think you can think your way through this, guys. Kevin, you're more than welcome to answer. So is Arthur. I think he's sorting out some family issue. Answer me.
It's about liability. That's the question. Why should only one person be liable? The judges gave him the order. Why would he administer that? Why would the lasher administer an extra hit if he listens to orders?
Excellent. So your question is as follows. You gave me two questions, one now and one before. The first question you ask is, why is the lasher responsible when the judge did the count? And part of that question is, well, then why is the lasher responsible when the third judge said strike him? So he's either responding to the third judge and striking upon instruction from the third judge, or lashing according to the count given by the second judge. Why would it be an intentional lasher bordering on a murderer? He's not responsible, the judge is. Does that make sense? So why would Rava use that as an argument? So the first thing I want to ask you is, let me break down the question. Why, guys, is the judge not responsible? Can anybody give me an answer? Gavin would have a clue based on something.
Okay.
What's your answer, Arth? Go for it.
Okay, I'm just taking a guess. Okay. It's the same as the, it's kind of crazy, but I've got this concept. It's like someone hiring a hitman, right? The hitman who actually does the killing is actually responsible, but the other guy who does the get later, something like that.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. So, Arthur, you haven't even done Sanhedrin and you're awake. So
that was one before. We did it before.
Correct.
So that's okay.
Correct. So there's a law that says Ein Shaliach Lidvar Aveira. The law does not recognize agency in the matter of transgression. Okay? What does this mean? Is that if you take even a case as serious as homicide, I know it's wrong to kill, I've given the order, the person knows it's wrong to murder. Since he took the action, is that they can't send one to the death penalty on earth, and you can't send one to a city of refuge on earth if you use a shaliach, if you use an agent to act on your behalf. Are you with me? In other words, if the judge turns around and says number 22, and it's actually number 23, then the judge is responsible in Shemaim. Arthur, you're completely correct. But on earth, they can't convict the judge for the miscount because he's not the one that actually administered the lashes. He just counted. So too, the judge that said strike him is only saying words, strike him. He didn't administer the lashes. So neither judge can be sent to exile for being part of this on earth. In Shemaim, believe me, Hashem knows to what extent the judges should have been liable or not, and they will be held accountable, especially if the person died, because the doctor said that this particular person being lashed can't take all those lashes. Fine. So that answers the question why the judge is not liable. Brilliant, Arthur. It's called groma, indirect. So you're not responsible for an indirect thing. So how do we answer that other question? Then why is the person striking liable if he followed the order of the judges? Kevin, what would you say? Arthur, Gavin, what would you say?
Okay, I would say it's quite tricky, and I'll tell you why. Because if you take the example where you hire an agent to kill your wife, that's different. That's very specific, and he goes there to do a specific job. He knows it's wrong. Yeah, we're talking about lashes. The guys there's nothing wrong with giving lashes. That's his job. His job is to give lashes. The other guy's job, okay, he might be a hitman. That might be his job too, but he knows it's wrong what he's doing. Yeah, if the guy gives the correct amount of lashes, he's okay. He's done nothing wrong. So that means you have to look at his job description, because if his job description says, I know I'm going a little bit too far, but if his job description says he needs to double check the count, he needs to count each lash as well, then he's 100% responsible just equally. If he's hasn't been assigned that.
Very good. Very good. So you've got
If
one
he hasn't been assigned, it is right.
Very, very good. So you've got 1 point in your favor and 1 point that we need a bit of work on. So, so let's look at job description. Okay, if it is job description, there's something called, might not be described, but it's about responsibility. So let's just take the case of a hitman and a doctor. So Gavin, in one respect you're correct, and in one respect it needs a little bit of tweaking. So where you're correct is that if it's this job description, let's use the word responsibility, because not every job is always laid out. There's a difference between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. So if you know your only job is to give lashes, and you've got any sort of responsibility to know that you don't take pleasure in your work. It's not like Little Shop of Horror where the guys enjoyed being a dentist because he enjoyed causing pain. If you're not a sociopath, you don't want to create more damage than necessary. So what happens in that case is the guy should be very scrupulous about people that he's lashing that perhaps have health disorders, etc. And that is part of his job description, or at least the sort of character that he should have to be a shaliach, appointed by the Sanhedrin, means he needs to have impeccable character. He can't be a sociopath. And therefore he was negligent because, as the Gemara said, he should have kept his own count as well. He should not just relied on the judge. I mean, how cerebrally hard is it to give a lash? It's not exactly rocket science. So the least he could have done is to count and have his own count with the judge if he's any sort of quality human being. And anybody that works for the Beis Din has to be a decent human being. I mean, they're doing a holy work. So you're right there, Gavin. It could have been part of his job description, and therefore he should have counted. Whether it was officially part of his job description or not, the Gemara sees your point, and it said the person administering the lash should keep his own count and shouldn't rely on the judge. Therefore, is equally responsible. That's number one. Where you were a little off is you had a thought saying, listen, the guy's a bad guy, he's a hitman, and therefore there's just no good that can come from it, whereas a person that's doing lashes is just following his job. So let's use an example, because I thought about what you're saying, and you've got a good point, but let's use an example of a surgeon. A surgeon's job is to fix a patient. I agree with you. But a surgeon's job is also competency. It's not just to fix a job. It's to make sure that you take into account all the possible things that could go wrong within your job, even if it's not within your job description, where you get a list of 200 procedures to follow as being part of a doctor. Check for this, check for that. Anybody that's a doctor, if he isn't aware of certain side effects of medications in the surgery, anesthetics, keeping correct blood pressure, etc., it might not be directly part of his job description, but he'll be responsible in Shemaim if there was any negligence as far as that's concerned. He might even have a legal case against him for killing a patient on the operating table. Is his job description a bad one? No, his job description is to save lives. But within that constraint of the job description is to do it successfully. Does that make sense? So, so Gavin's completely on the mark. Is that the guy should have kept his own count. Okay, excellent.
The only thing is, Damon, I just want to raise one last point on the same matter. This particular guy giving the lashes, he might have been too embarrassed. You're talking about 3 judges here, top judges, and now you got a different count to them. You could be embarrassed to actually verbally say, "Listen, it's not 40, it's 39, not 40, or whatever," you know.
You've got a good point. And on that point, I watched a program, The Good Doctor. Arthur and I watched a series about a guy with autism that's brilliant surgeon because he's like got a photographic memory and everything. I've watched episodes of ER, Nurse Jackie, etc. There's always cases because all of these shows reflect reality, where you've got an intern doctor or a nurse or a trauma nurse that questions the doctor, and the doctor says, don't interfere. You're not in a position to question my authority. But before Shemaim, you've got to give an account, and you can't be afraid and scared. You've got to turn around and say, Judge, with respect, I'm confused here. I've counted 23. And I would keep a piece of paper if I was the lasher. And I'd say, the judge says strike. And I make a note on a piece of paper, 1. And then I give a strike. And the next one, 2. Are you with me? I'd say 12:05, strike 1. 12:06, strike 2. I would write notes. I say, Judge, I've written it down. Something's off with the count. I know that you wouldn't want to make a mistake. We could all make mistakes. Can I show that? If the judge says, don't question me, then there's no ways if the person does that Hashem would hold the lasher responsible in Shemayim. Does that make sense? And then the lasher has to question the judge. Why? Because the lasher would go to exile. The lasher never gets to see his family again, not the judge. The lasher's entitled to question him, but he shouldn't question him verbally. What he should do is he should have a written count. 12:05, lash number 6, guy's breathing a bit heavily. Lash 12:07, the guy's gone blue. Just saying. Do you understand what I'm saying? Keep a count. All right, good. On that particular note, it says, rather, Rav Shimi of Nahadia said to Rav, where the judge himself made a mistake in the count. Okay. So now we're going to another case.
This is for Kevin. 1 second, I can't resist. Kevin, the guy doing the lashes, when he keeps track of it, is it overkill?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, okay, carry on. I couldn't resist.
So the agent...
Kevin, that's strike 1.
Well done, Gavin.
How many strikes have I got? 3.
The agent is liable to exile because he should have kept track of the count independently and not relied exclusively on the judge. The judge, however, is not subject to exile because he has not personally struck the victim. These issues are in Chetzot HaChoshen. Okay, right, so that we've discussed. Let's go on. The Gemara produces another source of challenge for the ruling of exile that's insufficient for an unintentional murderer whose gross negligence borders on the intentional. All right, so we're going to learn another brisa. So that's been taken care of. This other brisa says, all right, the challenge, if one throws a stone in the public domain and kills a passerby. Okay, this is from Makot 8a. I think I've actually got Makot 8a there. Here, let me just share the screen, guys. All right, Gav, you want to read?
Sure. The Gemara answers, the reference in the Mishnah is to a case where one demolishes his wall into a scrap heap where there is no reasonable expectation to find anyone there, as it is located out of the way. The Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of the scrap heap? If it is frequented by the multitudes because it is utilized as a bathroom, he is negligent. If it is not frequented by the multitudes, although it is a public domain in the sense that it is not private property, he is a victim of circumstances beyond his control, as there was no reason to consider the possibility that someone was there. Excellent,
excellent. So in Makot 8a, it discusses as follows. As it says, firstly, the Gemara initially, before it goes there, it says, if one throws a stone into the public domain and kills a passerby, he's exiled for an accidental murderer. Okay? It's an accident. Here in the Mishnah, we're dealing with a case where the murderer is an unintentional murderer bordering on the intentional. For he should have been mindful that people are commonly found in the public domain. Yet the Mishnah states he is exiled. Thus, we see that an unintentional murderer is bordering on the intentional, is subject to exile. So the first thing that happens, guys, is Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said, the Mishnah refers to where he threw a stone and he was in the process of dismantling his wall and disposing of the stones by throwing them in the public domain. So what Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak is saying, if you read the words, and by the way, you might turn around and say, well, why doesn't everybody else read the words of Makot 8a? It seems very straightforward that one who demolishes wall in a scrap heap, because what are we saying here? Akiva, if I turn around and say that you've got two guys, one just throws stones at people in the public, and one is dismantling his wall and is just throwing stones behind him. You're now saying that the one individual was absolutely had wanted to hurt people, and the other person was pretty selfish and was just considering demolishing his wall.
Right.
He wasn't a sociopath throwing stones or bricks off the top of a bridge at a highway looking to hit cars below. He was fixing the bridge, and he just didn't even look at cars below. They're two different levels of responsibility. They're both responsible, but the one is mentally deranged and wants to hurt people, and the other one is selfish. There's a hell of a difference. So the first thing that's mentioned here is that in the Gemara, Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said he was dismantling his wall. So you're not dealing with somebody that's bordering on an intentional murderer. Guy was selfish. He didn't even consider other people, and he's so preoccupied with demolishing his wall that he's just moving brick by brick, and he's not paying attention. So that's the first argument against this. Are you with me? Second argument is, what are the circumstances of the scrap heap? If it's frequented by the multitudes because it's utilized as a bathroom. So it's saying, hang on a second, what are we talking about here? We're talking about one of those big metal bins that vagrants would use to cleanse themselves. They'd either urinate in it or defecate in it. Now, you can't do it in South Africa where they just urinate against your wall. We're talking about you're at a higher level.
I've just got to go for 1 second. I'm just going to let Willie in. I'll be a second.
So what we're dealing with here, what are we talking about? The circumstances where there's a multitude of people or there's not people. We're talking about something very straightforward. Akiva, we're saying that, listen, if there are a lot of people there, you're grossly negligent. If there's nobody there, it's an unavoidable mishap. It can only be one or the other. So what are you talking about that you're an unintentional murderer bordering on the intentional? Does that make sense? You can't compare it to an intentional murderer, except if there are a lot of people there. Because then you shouldn't be throwing stones where there are a lot of people. If there's nobody, then it's an unavoidable accident. But how do you have a combination of the two? All right, so we're just going to unpack this a little and see what's involved. The Gemara answers that if the guy was dismantling his wall, as Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said, he was preoccupied, and he was just disposing his stones by putting them in the public domain. So in that particular case, his intent wasn't to injure, he wasn't just throwing it at the public. And the Gemara said, even so, he should have been sure that no one was in the place where he was throwing the stones. And the Gemara says, no, you're absolutely right. He was dismantling his wall at night. So why do you suggest that the Gemara proposes he's dismantling his wall at night? What implication does this have, guys?
At night?
Yeah.
There could be people, it depends on who's in the public thoroughfare. There's a lot of people.
Okay, so
going back and forth.
I'm at 2 a.m. in the morning and I'm dismantling my wall and throwing stones over. Is it more likely that there'll be people during the busy day, or less likely at 2 a.m. when you've got some drunk vagrant? What's less likely?
Less likely.
Less likely.
Less likely.
But it's still a possibility.
It is a possibility which the Gemara is going to address. And it said, listen, at night there's less of a probability, so he wasn't as grossly negligent. And the Gemara answers like Kevin and Arthur. Even at night, he should have been careful and made sure no one was present. Okay, so the Gemara then responds, rather it refers to where he was dismantling his wall during the day and throwing discarded stones in the trash pile. So the first case of the Gemara, before it refers to this case in Makot, is that it's a brisa. This isn't referring to the this issue in Makot. Is he was just throwing his stones while he was unpacking his wall and he wasn't focused on the public, which was negligence. Then they're saying, okay, so he never intentionally threw at the public. It's not good enough. Then the response was, no, he was doing it at night. Who's awake at 2 a.m.? Then they said, but still you should have been careful. It's saying, right, you're right. It was actually probably done during the day. But here he's not throwing the stones at the public. He's throwing it in a metal bin outside, in a trash heap. In other words, it's not directed at anybody. So the Gemara is saying, well, what was this case? What are the circumstances surrounding the trash pile? This is where it's referring to Makot 8a. If it's a place where many people are commonly found, as the trash pile serves as a public latrine, then he is nearly an intentional murderer and he should not be subject to exile, according to Rav Yossi Bar Chanina's reason. Why? Why, guys? Is he not subject to exile if the stone kills somebody?
Because
Intentional.
No.
Unintentional, but bordering on intentional. It's just like,
Way? In what way?
because he should have still taken care and not, can't just assume that there's no one around.
No, that's not what it's saying. It was saying as follows, Kev, saying if it's used as a public toilet, okay, where people...
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear that. Okay, sorry.
No, it's no problem.
Yeah, okay, got it.
If there are a lot of people that are using it as a public toilet, there's dustbin. Maybe it's for privacy, I don't know, and people can lock themselves in it or whatever. But some guy's on the gas and he's minding his own business and a brick him and he dies. In that case, if it's it's very popular. If it's a popular latrine, then it's bordering on intentional because it's popular. If there's nobody there, then it's an unavoidable accident and you're not held liable. So the reason why he's not eligible for exile is it was a very popular spot for relieving yourself for the vagrants. And therefore, you don't deserve exile, according to Rav's explanation of Rav Yossi Bar Chanina. Why? Because this is bordering on intentional murder. You know there are people frequenting it during the day. But if it's a place where many people are not commonly found, then he's a victim of unavoidable mishap and his actions don't warrant exile. So either way, Akiva, he doesn't warrant exile. Because if it's frequented by many people, that's bordering on intentional murder and he doesn't deserve the kindness of an exile. And in that case, he doesn't deserve that kapora, nor the protection of people that like this vagrant. Maybe he's got friends that are going to kill this person that threw a stone in the trash heap. He doesn't deserve the protection of the city of refuge, and he doesn't deserve the kapora. That's if it was a very common place to relieve yourself for vagrants. If hardly anybody ever went there and he killed the person, he's a victim of an unavoidable mishap and his actions don't warrant exile. Either way, he's not subject to exile. So the Gemara is saying, well, why is he exiled in this particular case? Rav Papa answered, the Mishnah's ruling is applicable only in the case of a trash heap that is used by people to relieve themselves at night and not generally used by people during the day. And occasionally there's somebody that happens to sit there even during the day. So the one who killed the passerby with the stone is not nearly an intentional murderer, since in the final analysis it's not used by people to relieve themselves during the day. And he's not a victim of an unavoidable mishap because there occasionally are people that use it during the day, very rarely. So that case is entitled to get exile. So Rava cannot use this as an example where an unintentional murderer bordering on intentional can use this as a way to say that he can get exile. So he can't use this as an example against Rav Yossi Bar Chanina to say that even even an unintentional murder aborting an intentional can get exile. This example by Rav Papa is refuted. Okay, we can end off on this note. Kevin, just teach us for a minute. We got a minute.
Okay. Jeez.
Well done. Thank you.
Okay, Shabbos. Okay, sure. Okay, Torah study. We've done that. Sleep. Okay, done sleep. Okay, 100 blessings. A person should endeavor to make 100 blessings every day. Since Shabbos prayers comprise a smaller number of blessings than those of a weekday, one should try to supplement them. In the Talmud, Rav Chia bar Abba speaks of a host who used to provide a spice box for his guests, in order that they may recite an additional blessing. Flowers too often provide a fragrance for this purpose, and it's customary to adorn the Shabbos table with them. That would be the besamim bracha, like you do in Havdalah. And you see Sephardim here in shuls, they have like flowers like in a vase, even on Shabbos, and guys smell them. And the fragrance, and to recite that bracha.
Last day, because you can't do brachas on